The background to the last attack, it begins in April 2014 when Hamas, the Islamic movement in Gaza, mostly in Gaza, but also in the West Bank, when Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, they formed a national consensus government. Hamas, as you know, is officially a terrorist organization, and the expectation by Israel's expectation was that the US and the EU would break off relations with the new consensus government among the Palestinians. Surprisingly, the US and the EU did not break off relations with the new government. They took a wait-and-see approach. Partially, in my opinion, it was retaliation by Secretary of State Kerry and the EU, retaliation at Israel for having sabotaged Kerry's peace initiative, in which he had invested a huge amount of time. Then, on top of that surprise, on top of the surprise that the EU and the US did not break off relations, on top of that surprise, the second surprise was the new government under the authority of President Abbas reiterated its acceptance of the three EU conditions, or the three, what's called quartet, the three quartet conditions for negotiations, namely acceptance of the conditions. 1, renunciation of violence. 2, recognition of all past agreements, acknowledgement of all past agreements. And 3, recognition of Israel. And which meant de facto, Hamas has now accepted those 3 conditions as well. If it were a sane world, you would think this would be grounds for hope and optimism. Hamas has indirectly, but nonetheless de facto, recognized Israel, renounces violence, and acknowledges past agreements. But what happened was Netanyahu, or the Israeli government, reacted in a rage. First of all, they were in a rage because, once again, Netanyahu's genius was being thrown into doubt by the US and the EU. He says Hamas is a terrorist organization, they want to destroy Israel, blah, 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 blah. And everybody is supposed to defer to his genial judgment, and they didn't. And for Netanyahu, this was the second slight, the second consecutive slight, because the EU and the US, or it's called the P5 plus 1, the negotiators with Iran, that the US and the EU effectively are negotiating with Iran, even though Netanyahu is against that, says Iran wants to destroy Israel, and blah, 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 or as your generation says, yada, 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 or that may be 2 generations ago. I'm telescoping generations at this point. So, and of course, the very last thing Netanyahu wants is a reasonable Hamas. That's a disaster for Israel, because the moment Hamas starts to behave reasonably, then the pressure begins to be exerted on Israel. Well, if they're being reasonable, why don't you negotiate and end the conflict? Which is the one thing Israel doesn't want. Not that it doesn't want to end the conflict, it doesn't want to end the occupation. That's the problem. and it needs an irrational, it needs a quote-unquote extremist Hamas in order to justify its gradual absorption, its incremental annexation of the occupied Palestinian territories. There's a nice phrase that was coined by an Israeli political scientist, a mainstream fellow named Avner Yaniv. He referred to these Palestinian peace offensives. That's the big problem. It's these peace offensives where the Palestinians are acting too reasonable, too moderate, and therefore they need to be sufficiently pummeled that they return to inflexible and violent tactics. Well, Netanyahu ranted and raged, why are you negotiating with Hamas? But he couldn't do very much about it until an apple dropped into his lap. A gift fell into his lap. And that gift was the abduction of the 3 Israeli teenagers in the middle of June of this past year. What we know as of now is, and what was known immediately actually, was 2 things. Number 1, the kids, the 3 teenagers, were killed almost immediately. That was known by Israel at the time. And number 2, that the Hamas leadership had not organized the abduction. There were Hamas members involved, but lower-level Hamas members. It was not something that the leadership had planned or prepared. But for Netanyahu, this was an opportunity. And if you're a good politician, and I suppose Netanyahu is a good politician, I can't really tell because he fills me with such loathing. He knew this was an opportunity to carry on another agenda, namely, how do you radicalize Hamas and so delegitimize them as a credible negotiating interlocutor? And so he launched what was called Operation Brother's Keeper, allegedly to find the 3 kids, even though, as I said, it was known almost immediately that they had been killed. And they proceeded to kill a half dozen or more Palestinians, blow up several Palestinian homes, all in the West Bank, ransack businesses, and arrest about 500 Palestinians, overwhelmingly Hamas members. And the purpose was perfectly clear for anybody who wanted to see it, namely, they wanted to keep provoking Hamas into a violent reaction, so that Mr. Netanyahu can then throw up his hands in despair to the world and say, you see, I told you, they're terrorists. You can't negotiate with them. Or as he put it later to a U.S. State Department official, he said that never second guess me again when it comes to Hamas. Well, initially, Hamas resisted the provocations, but there are other factions in Gaza which didn't resist the provocations. They started firing the homemade weapons, and at some point the whole thing spiraled out of control, and the new round, or the third major assault began. When it began, for some of you may not recall now, but between the period of July 7th and July 17th, The big question was whether or not Israel would launch the ground invasion. They had begun with their usual air assault, very heroic, launching air assault against Gaza. It's about as heroic as shooting fish in a barrel. But then the question began whether to launch the ground invasion. And the ground invasion posed a significant dilemma for Israel, which it's not been able yet to figure out how to handle. And the dilemma is this. These homemade projectiles, which Hamas and the other factions, they use, these projectiles, they cannot be disabled from the air. The only way they can be disabled is if you send in a ground force to eliminate them. It was the same dilemma Israel had in 2006 when it invaded Lebanon. It could not stop the Hezbollah rocket attacks without launching the ground invasion. But the problem is this. If you launch a ground invasion, it's going to mean significant combatant casualties. And Israeli society is not tolerant of or won't abide significant combatant casualties. It's a Spartan-like society where actually a civilian casualty is seen as less a cause of lamentation than a military casualty. So the first problem is if we invade, there's a serious problem of significant combatant casualties. There's only one way to prevent significant combatant casualties. There is a way, and it takes very little imagination to figure it out. The way you prevent it is, as the army enters into, in this case, Gaza, you destroy everything in sight, everything to the right of you, everything to the left of you, and everything in front of you. And that way, the probability of combatant casualties is drastically reduced, which is what Israel did in 2008. Okay, now my memory's going. 2008-9. Yes, 2008-9, which is what Israel did during Operation Cast Lead. So if you read the orders, and there's an extensive record, the officers told the soldiers as they entered Gaza during Operation Cast Lead, just destroy everything. If you see anything move, you blow it away. It's as simple as that. And it worked quite effectively. So in Operation Cast Lead, there were 13 Israeli casualties. Of the 13, 10 were combatants, and of the 10 combatants, 4 were killed by what's called friendly fire, where Israeli soldiers accidentally killed other Israeli soldiers. So in all, it was really only 6 combatant casualties. On the Palestinian side, about 1,400 people were killed, of whom estimates are about up to 1,200 were civilians. The problem was, after Operation Cast Lead, which caused an outrage of revulsion around the world, and the threat of what was called back then the Goldstone Report, for those of you who remember it, Israel was no longer able to get away with committing massive death and destruction on the order of Gaza, the order of Cast Lead, because the international community said no. That was the message of the Goldstone Report. So the dilemma Israel faced was, if you invade Gaza, and there are a large number of civilian casualties, you have a domestic problem. If you invade Gaza and you commit too much death and destruction, you have an international problem. So what do you do? And Netanyahu held off until a new gift dropped in his lap.